Hello there friends and welcome. For today's Elden Ring guide we have everything about the best Intelligence Caster build. And yes, we'll be showcasing our character against the toughest DLC bosses. As a matter of fact, the DLC did add the new ultimate strongest sorcery in the whole game that can easily destroy and melt any boss, including the final boss, in just 2 or 3 casts. But fear not, because I'll also provide you with all sorts of different fun and powerful spell strategies and combinations. After all, intelligence casters, just like faith casters, are quite versatile, and you'll have a tool for everything, from quite literally drilling enemies into submission at close melee range, to very powerful area of effect spells at either point blank range or from afar to easily destroy enemy packs, and of course even the ultimate sniping spells with the longest range possible, as to destroy enemies before they can react. Last but not least, you'll even get to do this all while face tanking enemies, even as a pure intelligence caster, with a build that can work regardless of where you are at, main game or DLC. So without further ado, let us get into our ultimate intelligence caster build, first with the best spells in the game. I might as well start with the best spells against bosses, as they are the toughest content, and well, we can't really begin without covering the new ultimate most overpowered sorcery in the game, Impenetrable Thorns. This works kinda like Dark Beads in its prime from Dark Souls 1 if you remember it. It deals an extreme amount of damage when cast at point blank range, as the thorns quite literally explode right from below the enemy. It can also proc bleed very fast, which of course increases the damage even further. Lastly, the thorns will keep on spreading in a vertical line from the point of impact, so it can also work to handle enemies that are somewhat far away. Honestly, there's no other ways to say it. It is definitely quite overpowered for how much damage it can inflict in such a short time, with but 3 to 4 casts. Anything in the game will melt from this, including the final boss of the DLC. It's so good that most agree it's gonna get nerfed hard, but well, it depends on how they nerf it, because even if they reduce the damage by half, it's still gonna be great. Amusingly enough, the spell does have a faith requirement, despite being a sorcery. But depending on the staff you use, it will fully scale based on sorcery incantation for great damage. While you can just spam this against any boss in the DLC and win, as I mentioned before, I'll also provide you with other tools, especially if they nerf it. So now let's cover our best boss debuffing spell, Runny's Dark Moon. When the enemies hit with this, they'll take a huge penalty to their magic resistance, which of course means higher magical damage taken. Great for most of your sorceries, especially your Impenetrable Thorns we just covered. The moon itself does nice enough damage, and it can even inflict Frostbite, which also results in higher damage taken for the enemy. It's quite long range, and you can and should usually start most boss battles by casting it as soon as you enter the boss's arena. Some bosses let you do this twice, like Relana or Malenia, others not so much, like the Dancing Lion and the final boss. Chances are you won't have time to cast this for free because they just rush at you as soon as battle starts. But it's still an amazing spell for debuffing. We also have our best spell for buffing against bosses, Terra Magica. When you cast this, you'll conjure a magical sigil, and so long as you're standing on top of it, and for a few seconds after leaving, all of your magical damage will be increased by around 20%, quite a nice boost. The best part is how easily it is to pre-buff with this before boss battles, because if you cast it very close to a boss's fog wall, the sigil itself is so big that part of it will persist beyond the boss's fog wall, which means as soon as you enter the boss's arena, you'll be right on top of your sigil for extra spell damage. Unlike Runny's Dark Moon, this is actually great for bosses that rush at you, because that's exactly where you wanna be, on top of your magical boosting sigil. Now let's cover some other spells for easily handling bosses, besides our OP Thorn sorcery of course. Starting with Zaymor Ice Storm. This has quickly become one of my favorite spells in the game, despite the fact it's not really that popular, but has many advantages, especially for a face-tanking caster playstyle. First, you create a rather huge tornado of ice around your character. that will constantly deal damage to the enemies and also inflict frostbite. The area itself is wide enough that it's quite easy to hit most bosses with this, including the ones that are moving away from you constantly like Mesmer. While the casting time is somewhat slow, the damage really adds up quite fast. As a matter of fact, even against the final boss of the DLC, well, unless you are spamming your OP Thorns, this was a very easy way of stacking damage to the max, with the Frostbite debuff being icing on the cake. Of course, by virtue of being ice, it's also amazing at bosses that are weak to it, and we do have some fire-themed bosses in the DLC like Mesmer. The FP costs and stamina costs are also quite low, so you can spam this reliably. And by the way, it also has very high boss stance breaking potential. Usually 3 casts on the DLC will be enough to poise break bosses for a nice critical. And it combines amazingly with the Terra Magica buff we just covered, considering you just wanna be stuck on top of one place spamming it anyways, as the boss freezes away into nothingness. Second, we have Rock Blaster, a spell that can be found quite early and is amusingly enough not just very fun but also quite powerful. When you cast this, you'll conjure a magic drill and quite literally start drilling on top of the enemies as if they were a piece of rock. Considering all of the damage bonuses you can get in the DLC, you can deal very high amounts of damage very fast with this. It's kinda like a melee Comet Azur, and will work even against the DLC bosses, but this spell truly shines when combined with the Iron Jar Aromatic consumable, as it will make you mostly unstaggerable for the duration, which means of course you can keep on drilling the enemies without being staggered out of the animation. It's also amazing for breaking the enemy's poise, you can do it quite fast. Now what about spells for the big large enemies like dragons? Shard Spiral is an amazing one for that, because of its unique property. Once you cast the spell, it will just keep on going and going instead of exploding upon contact with the enemy. Which means the shards will penetrate through the bodies of large enemies like dragons multiple times for huge amounts of damage, kinda like the Past Threads incantation from our Faith casters, with the added benefit of being way more spammable than something like Comet Azur of course, as you can cast it decently fast. Meteorite of Astel can also be great against wild enemies like dragons for the same purpose, as the Meteor Onslaught will hit big enemies multiple times, but it does cost very high FP just like Comet Azur. Besides that, Night Comet can be very powerful for single target damage, both for bosses and normal exploration, especially when you are dual wielding Staves of Loss. Each will increase the power of your Night Sorceries by 30%. But that does require a new game plus. Still, even with just one of these staffs, the bonus can be quite good, and the spell hits hard and is cast decently fast. It's just that for a face tanking playstyle, I would much rather spam our Ice Storm, Rock Blaster, or of course, the highly OP Impenetrable Thorns. What about Comet Azur? I think it's kinda past its prime, especially for the DLC enemies which tend to be hyper aggressive. And while this spell can deal very high damage, very fast, it has multiple downsides as well. You are easily staggered out of it. The FP cost is immense, so you have to rely on the Infinite FP Flask, which has been nerfed for 10 seconds instead of 15. And of course that does take a precious Wondrous Physick Flask effect slot. I mean, for the base game it can work just fine, but for the DLC, I think you have way better ways of dealing damage now. Now let's cover some other powerful spells, mostly for normal exploration now, starting with our best area of effect spells. Glintstone Arc is absolutely amazing. It's a starter spell even for the Astrologer class, but can be found very early otherwise, and well, it's just great. It fires a very wide arc that will penetrate through multiple enemies, so it's very easy to handle enemy packs with this. Plus the casting time is fast, it can be chain cast. The damage is decent as well for the early and mid game. For the late game and the DLC however, you might as well upgrade it into Adula's Moonblade, which will conjure a big great sword that you swipe the enemies with. It can deal great damage, will inflict frostbite, and even fires a projectile at the end of the great sword's swipe, which means it can hit enemies from far away, but for lesser damage. The DLC also added the new Gravitational Missile. It's also great for area of effect, as when you cast it, you pretty much create a small black hole that sucks enemies into it, culminating in a big burst that can deal extreme amounts of damage to easily clear the whole enemy pack. And well, don't forget our Ice Storm spell can also be used for normal exploration. Now what about the best single target spells for common enemies? Well, besides Night Comet we covered before, the newly added Rings of Spectral Light is quite powerful. For starters, it has amazing range, definitely way higher than most spells, so can hit enemies from very far away as a means of sniping them. It fires multiple rings that will quickly rush towards the enemies, and if they all hit, the enemy will take very high amounts of damage. Amusingly enough, you can also cast this at point blank, kinda like a shotgun, to force all of the rings to hit fast. Besides that, there's also something to be said about Glintstone Nails, as the damage output can be quite high as well. It's just that, well, it does have lesser range than Rings of Spectral Light, with the added benefit that it doesn't require Faith at all. Both of these spells are also somewhat hard for the enemies to dodge, which is another nice benefit. Now what about the best sniping spells in the game? For that we have Loretta's Great Bow and its upgrade, Loretta's Mastery. These are the spells with the highest range possible. You can really snipe enemies from very far away. It's just that nowadays, because of how good Rings of Spectral Light is, unless you're truly far, like firing the bow from a cliff above the enemies, I would rather use our rings instead. Lastly, you still have some spells that can be great for melee, such as the ever so useful Carrion Slicer, which is cheap and casts very fast. You just start slicing and dicing the enemy with the magical sword, followed by its cousin, Carrion Piercer. This can deal quite high amounts of damage and most importantly, will stagger most of the common enemies easily with just one cast, even some bosses. Not so much for the DLC because they all have extreme poise, but someone like Melania can be staggered with this. And of course, as the name itself implies, it will pierce through multiple enemies if they are close enough together. Now that we know what the best spells are for any situation, let's get into the best Ashes of War for our Intelligence caster, starting with my favorite one, Endure. I've already covered this in my other builds, but essentially this is what will let you face tank even the DLC bosses as a spellcaster, while chaining your spells again and again, without being staggered and having to wait for enemy openings. As Endure will not only highly increase your damage negation against all types, but also make you virtually immune to being staggered, for the duration, outside of some very few specific attacks like enemy grabs. The duration is very short, however, 3 seconds only, so ideally, you want to combine this with your spells, alternating between them, for extreme amounts of defenses even as a caster. But besides that, we also have another very fun Ash of War, Holy Ground. This can be used on shields, and just like Terra Magica, will create a magical sigil on the ground. While you are standing on top of it and for a few seconds after you leave, all of your damage negation will be increased by 20%, which is huge because it stacks with everything else, including buffs like Golden Vow. And you'll even get a very high amount of regeneration. When combined with the Faith regeneration spells, for example, your health will recover super fast. Most importantly, by virtue of being a stationary sigil upon the ground, it has amazing synergy with Terra Magica, as it works the same way. You can just cast it before entering a boss arena and the sigil will remain on the ground, except now you have both the best defenses and offenses by stacking Holy Ground and Terra Magica on top of each other. Now let us cover leveling up and stat allocation for our Intelligence Caster Mage. Intelligence, of course, is your most important stat, and you want 80 for the highest spell damage, as this is the soft cap. Amusingly enough, you do also need 10 strength with this character, so you can properly equip the best all-purpose staff for spell damage. Otherwise, your spells will cost a lot of stamina. Besides that, just the classic 60 vigor for a nice amount of HP, so you'll have an even better time at face tanking and spellcasting. With some points into mind, 30 to 40 is enough. And don't forget, you'll need at least 24 Faith to cast the new ultimate Impenetrable Thorns spell. But you might as well go for 25, because that lets you cast the best Faith buffs, including Golden Vow. You don't really need endurance, and well, the rest can be spent into mind. If you were starting this character from the beginning, be sure to get around 20 mind early, just so you won't run out of FP fast. Faith can be delayed for the DLC, unless you wanna cast some of the powerful Faith buffs before. Now let us cover the best gear choices for our Intelligence caster. Starting with our main weapon, a Magic Misericord Dagger. Daggers are not only light but also fast attacking, which is nice when you want to conserve FP against common enemies. And this is the weapon you'll be slapping your Endure Ash of War on, because you cannot apply it to Staves. Second, the Misericord has the highest critical damage boost of all weapons, so it's great for when stance breaking enemies with a few of your spells. Besides that, this one is optional, but a short sword with the Seppuku Ash of War, as a means of pre-buffing before boss battles, so you can proc some nice gear bonuses that also apply to spells like Lord of Blood's Exultation. Besides that, a staff for the passive benefits depending on which spell school you wanna boost, for example, Staff of Loss, for Night Sorcery, or the Meteorite Staff for Gravity. You don't need to upgrade the staff, it's just for the passive bonuses. As for the other hand, any Sacred Seal to cast your Faith buffs if you went with them, followed by your main staff, which will be Luza's Glintstone Staff, as it is still the staff with the highest amount of potential spell damage. The extra FP cost can be annoying with some spells, but for stuff like Zaymor Ice Storm, even our Thorn spell, it doesn't matter that much. Very early in the game you might as well go for Meteorite Staff instead. Last but not least, a shield so we can cast our Holy Ground Ash of War, ideally the Rickety Shield, because it weighs very little, and pretty much any class can use it without spending points into strength or dexterity. Now let's cover the best armors for our Sorcerer Mage. There's a lot of options for the helmets depending on which spell type you want to boost as far as damage. For our Impenetrable Thorns OP Sorcery, Alberic's set including Alberic's Pointed Hat. Otherwise, the Snow Witch Hat for cold spells, or the White Mask for an all-purpose whole spell boost. Only if you're going with the Seppuku pre-buffing strategy, of course. You also have the new Gravebird Helm for the very powerful Spectral Light Ring spell. The other slots are up to you, go with anything so long as you are left with medium load for proper rolling. Even if you go with mostly robes, you can still wear a medium or heavy pants, as I don't think Alberic's pants increase thorn damage as opposed to the other pieces of the set. Now let's cover the best talismans for our Sorcerer. These can go two different ways. One is a setup that's better for bosses, with a balance on damage negation and extra damage for spells. The other is mostly for normal exploration, going all out into damage. So first for bosses, Dragon Crest Great Shield as usual, so you can face tank. You can also use a second source of damage negation like Golden Braid, which is absolutely amazing for the final bosses of the DLC and the main game. Besides that, Godfrey's Icon for higher spell damage when charging, great for both your Thorn and also the Ice Storm spell. It's just that I do think this is somewhat bugged with a lot of the new DLC spells, because despite the fact they can be charged, the bonus from Godfrey Icon is not applying. I think it's an oversight and they'll get around to fixing that eventually. At least I hope. Other than that, the Graven Mass Talisman to increase the power of all sorceries. You can also use one talisman slot for something that increases your spellcasting speed, such as Radagon's Icon, which doesn't have any downside, or its big upgrade, the beloved Stardust, which has the highest casting speed boost possible. Just as if your character had 99 dexterity, doesn't get any higher than that. However, it does have quite a crippling downside, as it will increase the damage you take by a big amount, 30%, which for the DLC, especially bosses like the final boss, well, personally I find it far too dangerous, at least if you want to face tank. For normal enemies, however, feel free to go with it because you'll always have the range advantage as a sorcerer and they aren't nowhere near as fast as bosses. You can also trade Dragon Crest Great Shield for something else for more damage, like the Magic Scorpion Charm, which increases magic damage at the cost of extra damage taken, but way less than beloved Stardust. Also Lord of Blood's Exultation if you want to go for the Seppuku strategy, or want to spam your OP Thorn spell. As far as consumables, it's pretty simple as always. Boiled Crab for extra physical damage negation, and Iron Jar Aromatic can be quite useful for not being staggered, especially good for your Rock Blaster Driller spell. Now let us cover our Wondrous Physick Mix Flask effects. These also depend on whether you want the best damage boost possible or a balance between damage and extra defenses. But the Magic Shrouding Prac tier is as always great to increase all of your magical damage by a huge 20% for 3 minutes. Besides that, with the release of the DLC you can also go with the Blood-Sucking Cracked tier, which is the same effect and stacks, except it works for all damage types and has a downside. It will constantly drain your hit points, kinda like the Power Within spell from Dark Souls. Thankfully, through the use of our Faith regeneration spells and the Holy Ground Ash of War, you can easily make up for the hit points you lose. Now, if you wanna focus on higher defenses, then go with the Opaline Heart tier instead of Blood-Sucking for the big boost to all damage negation. And of course, if you wanna spam your Comet Azur, Cerulean Hidden tier for the infinite FP effect. It's just that it's been nerfed and only lasts 10 seconds now, I believe, instead of 15. Meanwhile, both Blood-Sucking, Magic Shrouding, also Opaline Heart tier, they last 3 minutes, so way more effective. Of course, if you're just abusing the Impenetrable Thorn spell, because of how fast it kills the enemies, you might as well go all out into damage, even for your talismans. For great runes, the same as usual, Morgoth's for the huge hit point increase, great for face tanking, or Godric's earlier for the +5 to all stats. Well, alright friends, so this was it for our Ultimate Intelligence Caster Guide. If you found it useful, as always, please remember to like, subscribe, and also consider becoming a channel member if you can. I really appreciate your support. Thank you for watching, and see you next time, friends.